All right, we're gonna get started. Okay, so welcome to our last salon in our series entitled Searching for the Self in an Age of Simulation. I'm Stephen Adubato, host of the Cracks in Postmodernity platform. And today we have Geoff Shullenberger, who's the managing editor at Compact Magazine, where I also work as an editorial fellow. And we're going to talk a little bit about the aftermath of the election and how the media has kind of shaped the whole experience leading up to and again including the aftermath. So Geoff, thank you for joining us for this discussion.
My pleasure.
Awesome. And just before we start, I want to ask if the people joining in, if you can mute for now, and then we're going to open it up maybe like 10-15 minutes towards the end for Q&A. So think of things you want to ask. If you'd like to, you can drop something in the chat, but we will be doing a back and forth Q&A towards the end. So, all right, to start things off, so Geoff, you've written about Baudrillard's series of essays entitled "The Gulf War Did Not Take Place," a very provocative, controversial piece of work that he put out. And I kind of feel compelled to ask you, did the latest election in the US actually take place, or was it all a simulation?
Good question. I think the Baudrillardian answer would have to be no, it did not, or it has not taken place, um, because that's just the nature of this space we've entered into of simulation, and specifically the idea that reality is so interpenetrated with its simulation at every point that the basic simple version of this very provocative and controversial thesis was at the time that something had sort of flipped in the relationship between what we might have thought of as representation and reality, right? That first you have a reality and then you have some kind of representation of it in whatever media form, right? But
Mm.
in the world of simulation, this this kind of new version of media that he saw emerging, first started writing about this in the 70s and, wrote various versions of this argument through the 70s, 80s, and 90s that the point of it was that kind of priority had been lost, that simulation often preceded and sort of pervaded the very thing it was, and the logic of simulation, not just the fact of specific simulations, but that the logic of simulation was one in which reality could no longer be separated from whatever representations of it were out there. So, I mean, in that sort of banal sense, or I mean, it's not a banal point necessarily, but we'd have to see everything in this way. Okay. Now, I
Yeah.
mean, for me, there's some way that to me, this election seemed, to my mind, the most useful concept for, I think people often think of Baudrillard as being about, fakeness or I don't know, artificiality or something like that. I think the most useful concept for what he's talking about is actually indeterminacy. Um, that when you think of simulations, it's a kind of probabilistic version of reality where reality is no longer just like a single thing, but it's a kind of array of probabilistic sort of estimates or different kind of versions of itself that are sort of arrayed out. And I think you can, find this useful for thinking about how sort of media fragments reality and how it creates kind of parallel competing realities that sort of interact with and conflict with and feed each other. But what struck me about this, I suppose, was just the sense of indeterminacy. I mean, I wrote something about this in the New Atlantis in 2020, actually before the 2020 election. But I was writing, or the kind of central image of the piece was the famous New York Times needle, right? Which on election night, if you were watching, and it happened again this year, actually, but on election night, if you were watching it in 2016, that's like the needle was kind of way over on the Clinton side, and then it started sort of wavering and flipping back and forth. And this, somehow corresponded to people's sense of like reality breaking or sort of reality ceasing to function. And so to me that was emblematic of the way that, and people talked about like, when Trump won in 2016, it was like there was a glitch in the simulation. Like this is kind of a standard trope in terms of like how people talked about that event. And then, I think so I wrote this piece on that subject that was kind of about polling as a version of simulation, polling, electoral prediction, the sort of Nate Silver world. But what was interesting in 2020 was, you had this prolonged period of indeterminacy, in which all of these kind of, conspiratorial narratives kind of flooded the zone and created this kind of miasma of uncertainty and just kind of questioning of the basic reality of what was happening, right? And you had that kind of happening or in narratives around the elections from both 2016 and 2020, where there was like just really a really bizarre array of like interpretations that did not seem to be grounded in a single reality, right? And that circulated in different kind of media formats and media platforms and so on. And so actually, what I'm getting to with all this is, in some sense, I've sort of experienced 2024 as like a kind of less weird election. It actually felt like it settled into a relative. I mean, okay, you did have like some sort of strange claims about, where like you had sort of blue anon type people, questioning the results in ways that directly echoed like what, the Stop the Steal people said in 2020, and things like that. And you had like, you have little pockets of it on the right with like, oh, how is it possible that Carrie Lake like lost even though Trump won or whatever? And, but nonetheless, those kind of narratives haven't really gained traction. It seems that actually we're kind of all on the same page in terms of like at least the basic facts of what happened, which was not true the last few times, right? That there was actually a greater kind of splitting of reality and this kind of chaotic, swirl of interpretations that, I think for Baudrillard there's a passage I often go back to in Simulacra and Simulation that's about an Italian terror, or he's talking about like the 1970s sort of years of lead terrorism that happened in Italy. And part of what he's talking about is that like, these car would blow up or whatever, and like, nobody that all these interpretations would swirl around it. Like, was it direct left-wing terrorism? Was it a state operation that was supposed to look like that? And he gives all these different scenarios of what it is, and his point there is that it's kind of all these things and none of them in terms of how it actually, and so I think that, and at least in terms of how it actually plays out, like even if there is a truth that you can get to, it sort of doesn't matter because it effectively is the case that it is all these things at the same time. And so both these last elections felt that way to me. There was this kind of ontological void at the center of them. Whereas this one somehow, I mean, there were various points in the campaign when it felt like that, but somehow the election event itself felt more kind of solid and like it, in some sense, brought us back to some sort of weird consensus, which still people can't quite make sense of or in many experiences traumatic, but at least the kind of epistemological bewilderment seems to have been significantly less than was the case the previous two times. So that's kind of struck me as like maybe there's some kind, we were in this period of just hyper fragmentation through media, and then it's as if somehow we're settling into some kind of new dispensation where it's not a comfortable or easy consensus, but there is at least some minimal sort of ontological solidity to it. So I don't know. I don't know if that's how you saw it, but to me it seemed like less weird and less less sort of Baudrillardian in the way that I'm describing them than the previous two. At least the final version of it. I don't think that's true of the campaign. I think if we get into the campaign, it's a different story, but the election event itself.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of surprised that you're saying it, but I see your point about the election itself being more kind of grounded in reality. But I don't know. I do have to say that the campaign this time around really felt much more absurdist than any previous one
Yeah,
I've ever seen.
right. I mean, that's sort of the paradox of it, and I would
Yeah.
agree with that too. So. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think, just to kind of set that up a bit, and maybe you want to move on to the next question, but yeah, I would say this campaign clearly it just unfolded in this new media landscape that we hadn't really quite seen before, and it would have seemed to me a few years ago sort of impossible that that would enable, and even maybe a month or two ago, it would have seemed impossible to me that that would enable some kind of some kind of like basic consensus of the sort that I'm alluding to about like the reality of events to take hold. And so I'm actually surprised that it did, because I don't think that was true for much of the campaign. And I agree that much of it was just far more bizarre in terms of its kind of its sort of groundlessness and just constant kind of indeterminacy than had been the case, and the kind of hollowness that seemed to often be at the core of it than had been the case in either of the previous elections, where there was still at least a kind of main. There was like, I mean, it was in many ways like both ridiculously propagandistic um, and also just sort of self-defeating, but there was at least a kind of central narrative that could be identified and sort of contended with. Whereas here, I just felt like there wasn't a central narrative thread. It was just, this year it did not feel like there was a central narrative thread. It felt like it was all
Yeah.
subplots or
Okay.
something like that.
True, but okay, before we get into the campaign, this kind of juxtaposition between like these bizarre kind of the bizarreness of the campaign trails versus the kind of the normalcy of the election itself. Like, is this a reason to hope, or does that like freak you out even more? I don't
I,
know. Like, that
I,
juxtaposition to me is really weird.
I have to admit, I don't know, my own mood has been like much more optimistic than I
Mm,
expected.
yeah.
I think, partly because it's like it feels like we did clearly kind of punctuate the previous era, like whatever happened
Mm,
with this election, it brought a clear close to the prior 8 years, and I think that's almost entirely to be celebrated.
okay.
um,
Fair.
if not, I would say maybe entirely to be celebrated. Um, and
Uh,
then beyond that, yeah, it signaled the rise of a new sort of dispensation, and there are a lot of confusing signals about what that's going to look like, but it's at least interesting to be able to observe it. Um, so I don't know. I mean, I feel like, okay, we're entering some kind of new dispensation that has manifested itself, and now our job is to, at least as people who are, and insofar as we're sort of cultural and political commentators, our job is to just kind of try to figure out what that is. So I think
okay.
that's I guess my hopeful mood.
Fair. Or maybe it's just the calm before the storm of something even more absurd. I don't know. But all right, but no, so I do want to draw out this point from one of your compact pieces about Baudrillard, because you try to make this distinction between this common conception of like the Baudrillardian matrix, that what we see is a replica of reality. But what you're trying to say, especially commenting on the Gulf War didn't take place thing, is that it's that the media's coverage of these kind of sensational events, it's not that it's a replica, it's shaping these events before they even happen. It's kind of bringing them into existence. It's manifesting them in a way to the point that the coverage and the event become indistinct. That the event itself is defined by the coverage of it. And I think this is interesting again, considering the way these campaigns, the way they were developed, because I don't know, like I was mentioning to you before, if you look at Harris's campaign videos, this idea that, like, the one in particular to me that was extremely absurd was like all these quote unquote manly men saying that, real men are going to vote for Harris and they're going to support, women's right to choose and all this. And I mean, it's kind of what the most absurd thing is, like, you have this noticeably effeminate guy who's posing as a trucker saying, yeah, as a real man, I'm voting for Harris. And it's like, clearly this is so detached from reality that you wonder if she actually thinks people are going to take this seriously. And then of course, like, what I noticed with Trump's videos is, I mean, I don't know. The thing is that, like, we already know that he's this absurdist, kind of larger than life, performative figure. So I mean, between his campaign video saying, she's paying for the transgender surgeries for prisoners, for illegal immigrants, or the whole they're eating the cats, they're eating the dogs line at the debate. It's like, I think people found his form of absurdity more compelling because he's not trying to act as if he's normal. Like, that's part of his shtick. But no, I'm curious what you noticed about, like, how they kind of developed their campaigns and this, like, I don't know, the blatant detachment from reality.
Well, I mean, to me, the most crucial example would actually go back to, when it was still the Biden campaign, right? Which, I mean, so I think, to my mind, I was thinking about before this, what are the crucial, like, mediatic events of this campaign? I'd say the first one was the debate,
Yeah.
the Biden debate.
Yeah.
The second one was the assassination, the attempted assassination. And the third one was perhaps the Madison Square Garden rally,
Yeah.
which I think ended up being kind of it did end up being the capstone of the event. And the way that it was parsed in the mainstream media was, turned out to be essentially wrong and just, completely misapprehended what it was. Um, so, I think the Biden debate, like the sort of catastrophe of the debate, was really interesting, for all kinds of reasons in terms of, like, media and media history and so on, because I mean, it spoke to a kind of detachment from reality that you were hinting at there.
Yeah.
And it was kind of this, return of the repressed moment, or it was like this thing that somehow the party believed that it could just kind of pretend wasn't the case, and in some cases create these kind of bizarre conspiratorial narratives around, like, that. I mean, and then that happened after the debate. Like, you had this very Baudrillardian thing where it was like, oh, like, it was actually rigged against him. Like, if you studied the lighting and, looked at how the camera angles were, like, there was some conspiracy to make him look, old and frail or whatever. And, like, so you did have these kinds of this kind of Baudrillardian indeterminacy around it. But, and so there was a bit of that, but again, it just, that, like, that didn't work ultimately. What happened was it was just experienced as this incredible trauma and this kind of encounter with, like, the real, in some sort of Lacanian sense, where, like, that it's just this kind of horrifying excrescence that, you've kind of built this entire, like, symbolic edifice around, sort of trying to excise or exclude, and then it just comes back and reasserts itself. And so that seems like, and it was interesting in relation to, the sort of paradoxical role of televisual media, right, as both, and this is central to kind of Baudrillardian account of things, as, like, both a means of kind of the spreading of illusions and deceptions and so on, but also a means of kind of confronting us with the unbearable reality that we've tried to deny or suppress. And I mean, it's interesting in relation to, like, the history of TV debates, the famous Nixon Kennedy debates, where, these kind of just unpleasant physical features of Nixon became kind of uncomfortably evident to viewers, and that was, famously seen as sort of the decisive aspect of that debate, whether true or not. It speaks to how that the kind of revelatory or kind of reality exposing function of the televisual, which again has this kind of dual role. And so I think like it can be the vehicle of kind of carefully crafted deceptions and the vehicle by which those deceptions fall apart. And so yeah, I mean, I think that debate was extremely interesting. And then, I think you have to kind of relate it semiotically to the, because that's the origin of the Harris campaign, right? And, that the kind of overt artificiality of the campaign and the way that it became this kind of weird strategy of avoidance, where you would never say anything remotely controversial. You would just, it was just like an endless series of banal platitudes about like the middle class and freedom and joy, where like the whole point of it is just to like enjoy the experience. It's like the super ego injunction to enjoy. It's like the whole function of it is just, it's like completely politically empty. It's just sort of, you're supposed to experience the joy of, I guess, not any longer having a sort of decrepit old man as your who's definitely going to lose as your candidate. So it's like this totally self-referential thing. And so then the campaign just becomes this kind of weird strategy of avoidance of the encounter with the real, or of anything that might threaten that encounter, right? There's something very neurotic about the campaign. It's like everything about it is an attempt to circumvent a similar kind of exposure. And so it's incredibly glossy and sort of overtly sort of superficial and vacuous. And then you brought up, I think in our notes before, that weird Harris video from last week, which was almost like the inversion of all that, where she kind of seems like a bit weird, kind of drunk, maybe, just like it's like she's finally letting loose or something.
Did you see the AI version where somebody like photoshopped in her holding like a bottle of like Jameson or something? Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, so it was as if that was like the very thing that kind of weird, unpleasant, kind of awkward, creepy vibe of that video was like it was as if the very thing that was avoided through this kind of aggressive superficiality and emptiness was finally kind of allowed to reveal itself.
Yeah. Yeah, and so I do want to go back to one of Trump's last rallies, I guess, in Madison Square Garden, where this whole scandal over Tony Hinchcliffe, the comedian's joke, if you can call it that, about Puerto Rico. Um, yeah, I mean, for me, that was one of the like key moments where I felt like, okay, this is not even happening. Because like the cycle of outrage that ensued after it, and then like something that you've written a good amount about, like this politics of resistance, to me, it was like incredibly absurd because like first of all, you have this comedian say something ridiculous about, about Puerto Rico, which first of all, it wasn't even funny, like comedically speaking, but also like clearly it was stated to provoke outrage. Like, and the fact that all these responses on the internet, especially from celebrities, it's like, I don't know. I had this eerie sense that it all felt extremely scripted. And I think, again, like as you've written about like discourse of resistance, like to me, it's sounding more and more like algorithmic in a sense. Like so many of these, like the cycle of outrageous events, outrageous statements, and then the reaction against it, the resistance against, we have to stop hate. Like to me, it just sounds like people are reading off of this, AI generated script that to me, like, yes, like this is the epitome of a non-event. Like this is not even happening anymore. And yet it kind of takes over Twitter and the media. And I mean, I do want to also bring up, like you wrote this piece on Compact Substack about this, this kind of seemingly staged protest at Brooklyn Academy of Music with this play. So I don't know. I mean, let's get into this though, like this sense of like the scriptedness, the artificiality of resistance and these cycles of outrage that continue to take up our feeds. What do you see going on there?
I wonder if part of it is just people having become habituated to, the outrage cycles of social media were, felt spontaneously and kind of responded to that, it awakened this kind of lizard brained sort of mob behavior that had been sort of kept in check in other contexts in all sorts of ways for a long time. And then it just kind of unleashed these sort of darker energies. And I think on some level, people just got more habituated to that cycle. And so, part of that means like people's, you know, people have at least, they've developed a kind of greater ability to stand aloof from it, perhaps. But then at the same time, I think the flip side of that is that the politics, that it's become something that is more cynically marshaled by political actors and so on to produce certain effects. And I think that can produce a kind of further distancing, perhaps, because people are also aware that that's happening. I just feel like the kind of algorithmic predictability of it, as you said, it takes away some of its kind of demonic, like some of the kind of demonic force of these dark energies as they were initially unleashed, and like people didn't really know where they were coming from, and it was, very, very disturbing. Whereas now there's something kind of familiar about it, and people, I think, have some, even if it's not like a totally conscious sort of critical instinct about it, people have a greater awareness. But the result of that is maybe also a greater cynicism, to the extent people
Okay.
participate in it. I wonder if it's just experienced more cynically.
I mean, but to me, the fact that people kind of fall into this kind of algorithmic thinking and feel like are kind of oblivious to the fact that it's all kind of BS, that like it's like they feel so fervently these emotions, these moral convictions, which are based in nothing. Like to me, that's I don't know. I mean, to me, that's kind of the epitome of the diabolical and like the true sense of the word. Like this, like in Greek, it literally means to throw apart, to separate. Like to me, that says that we're completely detached from the real now, and that's what I don't know. Like I find it very disturbing that like I mean, I was trying to have a conversation with one friend who felt like very strongly about a certain side of this election. And I was just like, you realize that, I don't know, like your reaction to this is kind of just like mimetically, you're just responding to the herd. And they had like zero sense of what I was trying to say. But to me, I don't know. I don't know. That's like extremely bizarre and not a hopeful thing. But
Yeah, no, I wouldn't say I feel hopeful in that way. And I did find the kind of, yeah, I mean, what I would emphasize actually is the cynical aspect of it.
mhm.
I think that's quite disturbing. I I think there was, I don't know. I mean, we could talk about the whole kind of dogs and cats Springfield, Ohio thing was, it was honestly like one of the more disturbing, although it was also absurd. It was
Yeah.
perfectly absurd in the way you're describing. I mean, it was also very disturbing in ways that, I was, genuinely concerned about at the time. But despite its absurdity, I think that the thing that struck me about it was, um, that it kind of played on these very primal questions of like taboo
Yeah.
and sort of the sense of like it's almost sort of dietary taboos or something like that, where
Yeah.
the thing that was framed as most as kind of most condemnable was this kind of strange set of violations that no that somehow were actually like deeply instinctually felt apparently by the people who are outraged by it. But no one could necessarily quite define or pin down and then there was this kind of Baudrillardian sort of swirl of attempts to pin down some sort of referent or some kind of solidity at the center of it. And so you had all these images brought in where it's like, oh, there's like a guy with a goose, and it's like, oh well, first of all, it's a goose, which I don't know, people do eat geese, but actually, like, it turns out he wasn't even in the same town. He's, not Haitian, and he was like taking it out of the road because it had been hit by a car or something. Like, it was just so there were all
Yeah.
these attempts to kind of fill in, there was this this kind of mythical and this, I guess, gets us more into Girard, but like this allegation of a kind of mythical violation of some primal taboo.
Yeah.
And then there were attempts to, to the point where you literally had like, I think a dozen or 2 dozen like conservative reporters like descending on the town, and trying to find like one thing that they could. And then, what was interesting is that when you saw what they actually produced out of it, a lot of it was like, yeah, it's just kind of about like more banal stories of sort of corrupt, slightly corrupt local politicians and NGOs and, kickbacks and things like
Yeah.
this. And so
And
like
yeah.
but there was, in relation to what you said, there was this sense of like, people being triggered in this deeply kind of primal way by this narrative and this kind of activating something that that then there was kind of an attempt to ground it or um to kind of establish some reality or to kind of anchor the narrative in,
Yeah.
and that didn't really work. But and then there was even like this bizarre video that was produced from not Springfield but Dayton, Ohio, where there was like this thing on a grill that might have been a cat but also might have been a chicken or something like that. It was complete.
Yeah. I
So it
think
was
that,
like completely
yeah.
absurd, but and like the absurdity of that being like such a central moment in the campaign
I think
was
the
completely
best was
fascinating.
Marianne Williamson and her kind of like voodoo kind of did you see that tweet? Yeah. That she was saying,
She was like, "We should be concerned about voodoo or
she
something."
said not that they're, actually doing it.
Yeah,
Voodoo's not a neutral. Yeah.
right.
I don't know, but my whole take on like the kind of like the resist hate discourse that ensued from that kind of statement was like I continue seeing people taking these statements saying, look at all the people who are now going to feel incited to unleash their racist kind of sentiments towards everyday people, which like I've seen firsthand. Like I've seen people who take something Trump says and they're like, yes, those dirty whatever, fill in the blank there. And it's like to me, the moral outrage, like, yes, okay, obviously that's a very problematic thing if you're going to have people going and attacking whatever racial group. But the real scandal to me is not so much that it's inciting racism, it's that people, again, like blindly take what they hear at face value from whatever side and just like completely believe it. And don't look at the fact that this is all like extremely performative and absurd. Um,
Well, but
I
also
don't,
they don't, and this is kind of, they also just, there isn't um, there isn't a central, if there's no kind of central narrative in which people can, anchor themselves for the most part, it just opens up the possibility of this kind of
yeah,
proliferation and of a kind of selection of the narrative. It's like you're just selecting the narrative that serves the most useful kind of polemical purpose, and that's
yeah,
clearly what's happening a lot of the time.
yeah. And I mean, on this topic of, these kind of expressions of resistance against these alleged scandals, like again, with the Tony Hinchcliffe joke, I wrote this piece about Bad Bunny, the Puerto Rican singer who put out this like compilation on his Instagram page, basically saying, F you, Tony Hinchcliffe, Puerto Rico is beautiful. Therefore, I am now endorsing Harris. And like I was trying to highlight the kind of absurdity of these celebrity endorsements and how, like, if you take Kamala is brat, the infamous tweet of Charlie XCX, but also like if you look at what's become of SNL, like the fact that Maya Rudolph did this opening skit with Harris, basically, I mean, it was a blatant endorsement. Um, I find it very alarming how like you have these very decadent kind of elite figures, these celebrities, these singers, entertainment outlets like Saturday Night Live, presuming to preach on politics when their real job is to entertain. I mean, there's something very presumptuous about it, but also again, like there's something very bizarre. There's something absurd about like why is this singer who's normally talking about like sleeping with a bunch of girls after getting drunk at a club, or again Saturday Night Live, which is supposed to be lighthearted humor. Why are they presuming to talk about these things? And why, like why are we kind of I don't know, why are we dumb enough to actually take them seriously? I don't know, like, what do you see there? Like the kind of susceptibility we have to these kind of celebrity figures becoming alleged voices of the people.
Well, I mean, I'm curious what you think because my overall sense was, one of the takeaways of the election was like the triumph of the B list or something, where
Mhm.
it turned out like the A list celebrity endorsements weren't, which like a few people commented all along. It was kind of these like weird kind of runner-up types who were in the Trump camp were just clearly kind of
Yeah.
outgunned by the sort of Taylor Swifts and so on of the world. But like in a sense, it doesn't seem to have mattered enough, particularly with the kind of whatever low frequency voters who are seen as most susceptible to those kind of endorsements. But yeah, I mean, I think it is, I'd see it as partly about a kind of crisis of authority, like who is seen as an authority to whom people turn as, some kind of, some kind of guide, somebody to, to provide some kind of orientation in the world.
Mhm.
And again, that's a space that's very fragmented, right? And then then you have on the other hand this, like the Joe Rogan endorsement and the Joe Rogan interview, and like that's been kind of relitigated on the Harris side. Like, did it matter that she did or didn't? That she didn't do that interview. I mean, Rogan is himself kind of an interesting figure here, where he's like a celebrity, but he's also become a certain type of kind of intellectual authority,
Yeah.
weirdly. And so, you see these figures who kind of merge these different functions. And I think the the thing I saw, I would say, happen kind of with the Harris campaign was like there was sort of an attempt to, clearly kind of revive this moment when you had a clear kind of alignment of celebrities, particularly around Obama, right? Where you had like this, the whole kind of A-list celebrity set, who were,
Yeah.
representative of a certain kind of aspiration and a certain sense of like what the, of where the sort of cultural center of gravity in America lay.
Yeah.
And I think, the fact that like that there was an attempt to kind of reassemble that and reassert it, with Taylor, Beyonce, whatever. But, in a sense, like the more notable stuff, and I think it's more notable because, I mean, the fact that it's more notable is shown by the fact that people are still discussing it, was kind of like the weird, like the podcast, like the Rogan, Theo Von type, Lex Friedman
Yeah.
type figure, where, they're just these like this particular subset of influencers who are a kind of celebrity who, seem to speak to um, a certain subset of the population in quite a powerful way. And, their particular status within the society is still somewhat nebulous and harder to figure out.
Yeah.
But I think their role, in terms of like what was distinct about this election, it was one thing definitely was the role of that kind of media space. And I'd say in a way the kind of waning role of the A-list celebrity endorsement as a
Yeah, that's
as
right.
a as a factor. I mean that clearly there
Um,
was an attempt to solicit it and cultivate it, but I sort of think it's like it's less potent symbolically than it might have been in the past.
yeah, it's interesting you're bringing up the role of celebrity endorsements in like the Obama era because I remember McCain had a video kind of, or was it campaign? I think it was McCain who was saying, was kind of like smearing Obama for like presenting himself as a celebrity. And it was like a
Right.
video montage of people like Paris Hilton coming out of a limo with the paparazzi and then,
Yeah, yeah.
you know, juxtaposing that with Obama and his celebrity status. And he was trying to be like, look, he's not a real politician. He's just a
Right.
celebrity.
Right.
But also like the fact that the celebrities he did keep around him, like Beyonce and Jay-Z and like trying to speak to the sense of Black excellence, the great Black artists,
Right.
versus Harris having Megan the Stallion twerking at her rally. I mean, you see the kind of like drop in standards of celebrity status. But I mean, I do kind of think Trump is the reason because I mean, Trump himself is this I don't know, this campy kind of like lowbrow reality TV star who, yeah, like I think you're right to say that like he did attract these kind of B-list, kind of weird celebrities, like like these professional wrestlers and Tony Hinchcliffe. But I mean it's funny because he got a couple of Puerto Rican like reggaeton singers and rappers to come on his campaign or to speak at like one of the rallies. And yeah, it's funny because like Bad Bunny is like he's been number one on the Spotify global charts for 3 years. So like he's definitely up there. But then these like lower down kind of singers went for Trump. And then one of them, after the whole Tony Hinchcliffe joke, changed his mind and put out a video on Instagram saying like actually no, Trump is bad for Puerto Rico. And it's like maybe that was his attempt to kind of like make his jump into the A list to kind of, boost his status. But yeah, no. So anyway, I did want to move on while we have time to the kind of aftermath and these election autopsies, as people are calling them on the left. Because I don't know, what struck me is that like now it seems permissible for a kind of populist left critique of what's become the Democratic Party, which previously was kind of banned from any kind of democratic spaces. So like when Bernie put out this letter on X saying, the Democrats have forgotten working class people, they've forgotten bread and butter issues, we become too elitist. A bunch of people jumped on that bandwagon and started criticizing the Democratic Party again from this particular like this definitively left position. And it just like it's strange to me because it's like now that there's no threat of people like Bernie or of that people of that ilk actually threatening um you know the position the trajectory of someone like Harris. Like now it's okay for that to be said in these spaces. And it made me think, like you quoted in one of your essays, what was his name? I think it's Olufemi Taiwo's concept of elite capture and how, I don't know, in a sense, it seems like these kinds of critiques, these like further left populist critiques are permitted in a sense now that they're impotent. So it's like in a way, it's kind of capturing this kind of critique and rendering it, I don't know, powerless, so that I don't know, like the status quo kind of is maintained. Like I highly doubt that this is going to change the future of the Democratic Party. I highly doubt they're going to reevaluate. So I don't know, like, well, what do you think about the fact that like this is out there in the mainstream, these kinds of further left critiques of what's become the Democratic Party? And I don't know, like, do you think they have any potential to affect real change?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely interesting development. I agree, and you're right that it, part of what's interesting about it is it emerges at a moment when it's weakest in terms of its I mean, it's confusing. You have I think there are different versions of it, right? Because part of what's confusing right now is that, like, I don't know, the sort of blue, it's like you have the blue dog Democrat on one hand, the like Marie Gluesenkamp Perez figure, who's sort of been discussed and debated quite a bit, and a handful of these other sort of whatever Democrats who have managed to win in red districts or very competitive districts. And then you have the sort of Bernie critique, which is not necessarily kind of aligned with that, although historically it's notable that some people, I remember pointing out back in 2016 that if you looked at Bernie's like electoral history in Vermont, he actually did well in like the areas of Vermont that had been most Republican at one point. So that there was, and he did, for a while he was like pro gun rights and things like that. So I mean that I feel like there's sort of there's a situation where no one can deny that something like went seriously wrong with Democratic politics. Like no one can really deny that the party is in a bad state. And so I think that, after 2020 and 2022, you could sort of deny that because 2020 they won, and like the fact that they won, even if it was by a smaller margin than anticipated, kind of erased a lot of the doubts that were raised about the nature of that victory and the fact that it involved all these significant losses of support from traditional constituencies. And then 2022, you avoid the red wave. So it's like you get this kind of series of situations where you can kind of avoid contending with the fact that the party like sucks and has descended into this like bizarre fantasy world, which again is why I think the Biden debate in June is so fascinating, because it really reveals not just like, not even in terms of policy. I think it just reveals the strange kind of obliviousness and groupthink that's overtaken Democratic elites, in terms of their just kind of belief that they can get away with sort of blatantly deceiving people and so on. So so I think it's clear that that people just couldn't deny that anymore, which I think again speaks to this kind of new reemergence of a certain consensus. Like you had a couple of weird attempts to claim that, oh, like the Democrats lost because they didn't mobilize their base by going fully woke. This is like, I wrote about this in the piece called "Yes, the Left Lost," but on the Substack. But I just don't think it's hard for me to believe that anybody really believed that. There are people who kind of needed to save face by saying it, but I don't know. I think there are two problems, or that there are at least two problems for this kind of resurgence of this. And whatever. I mean, I follow a lot of people who are roughly of this outlook. The sort of liberal patriot crowd, as well as like the Damage Magazine crowd, and that they're often all very insightful and good. But the thing that strikes me first of all is that, as you said, there's still Bernie, but there isn't really much left of whatever dissenting strain within the party may have once existed, and what there is quite incoherent in itself. And I would say maybe the more interesting thing is like this guy Dan Osborne in Nebraska, who came within a few points of unseating the Republican incumbent and ran a completely independent campaign and basically told the Democrats, like, don't support me, don't endorse me, I'll do my own thing. And so it seems like there is a possibility for a kind of whatever essentially kind of liberal patriot type politics, kind of center populist politics that Osborne seemed to represent. Interestingly, Bernie conversely has become far less independent of the Democratic Party than he used to be, right? So to the extent that he's still there, people are talking about how he needs to start a new party, but he was just like given some leadership position within the Democratic Senate, which is bizarre. I mean, he's still not supposedly not a Democrat, but as far as I can tell, he's become much more fully integrated into it. So that's kind of one thing that's a challenge. And then the other thing is, that I think the fact that Biden did kind of pursue some of these populist policies, and then I think it's sort of wrongly interpreted as like, oh, he lost because he did this stuff. And that's going to be a helpful argument for people who don't want to take that approach, including, basically a lot of the people who are advising Harris, who were not fans of the sort of more populist dimensions of Biden's policy. So they can say, well, Biden did that populist stuff, he lost, so no point in us trying to do that stuff again. So I guess my own take, which I think is unlikely, but is for any of that kind of stuff to be successful, it probably has to go through more kind of Dan Osborne-like figures running independent campaigns at state and local levels and possibly building something out of that.
Yeah. Okay. So before we open it up to questions, I'll ask you one more thing. So, I mean, you've expressed a lot of skepticism about the whole kind of anti-woke reactionary phenomenon. And I mean, a lot of people have seen Trump's victory to be a sign that, now woke is dead. DEI is not going to be funded anymore. We're going to be free to say what we want. I don't know. What do you see in this kind of optimism? I mean, given your criticisms, your reservations about the whole anti-wokeness thing, like, are things actually going to change? Are they going to get worse? Is it going to go in a whole other direction? What do you see?
It's a good question. I sort of think the long piece I wrote about this, the poverty of anti-wokeness, sort of argued that, all of these culture war debates are just symptomatic of a kind of deeper loss of, kind of loss of an animating national narrative, a series of kind of corrosive doubts about, the sort of history and nature of America, which are themselves, symptomatic of just a broader kind of trajectory of decline. And so, without going into that too much, I ultimately think whatever happens culturally is going to be kind of downstream from what happens materially on some level. I think at the moment, there for various reasons, the sort of cultural energies that surged particularly around 2020 have just kind of waned. They're not as they're just not as potent. People aren't buying into them as much, and so that means that the the comparable energies that are you know primarily directed in opposition to all of that are similarly, I think, kind of adrift, and they're not, they're just not going to have the same sort of array of targets to mobilize themselves against. So I don't know. I mean, I think there are many. I'm just talking about sort of cultural energies here. I think institutionally, we could sort of say, the picture is kind of mixed. Um, there's a lot of ways that these ideologies are very entrenched and will be kind of difficult to dislodge from the institutions, and also when there are attempts to dislodge them, that will in some ways kind of re-energize them, because this is people's kind of sinecures at stake, and people are mobilized to defend the things that pay their rent and so on. So it's I think it's hard to say, but I think the overall picture is one in which the ability of these kinds of narratives to gain broader traction and mobilize people has been declining. And so that means that it's going to be more a kind of war of attrition at more localized levels between people who, have some kind of vested interest in maintaining this set of ideological positionings, and people who are trying to dislodge them.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say that it was one of your pieces in Unheard. I think it was about Milo Yiannopoulos. But I mean, I do think you were right at the conclusion when you said it's what's happening, the direction we're headed in. It's not like a new kind of right anti-woke hegemony, but it's, I think, I don't know, even more chaos, even more like unmooring from objective kind of norms of discourse and conduct, which I don't know. I mean, my kind of like cracks in postmodernity framing of this is that this crack, this fissure within the norm is going to be an opportunity for something new, something potentially positive. It could also open the door to like really horrifying things. So I'm looking out for whatever good is going to come from it. I'm looking for any new opportunities. I'm also cautious of what else could go wrong, but anyway, so if anyone has a question, if feel free to unmute and you can go ahead and ask. Okay. Well, if no one has questions, we can wrap it up. Jeff, do you have any closing thoughts you want to wrap this up with?
Yeah, I do think that question you just raised of norms is something I've been thinking about quite a lot. And, I think part of what's weird is the way that the right has kind of become, became the anti, that the left became the enforcer of norms and the right became the sort of anti-normative party and became, invested in this kind of, and I'll bring up the Milo thing in a second, but invested in this kind of sort of set of cultural tactics of kind of provocation for its own sake. This kind of merry prankster, almost sort of situationist. And again, I mean, I think this is one way to understand Trump, that he's kind of the he has the purest instinct for this kind of thing of anybody. Like he doesn't have any theory of it. He just has his instincts, and they're incredibly masterful in terms of how he kind of engages in these games of provocation and baits other people into participating in them and reinforcing them and so on. But the figure of Milo is interesting here because he was this sort of figure of that right wing transgression, right? While at the same time he, I suppose, was also an agent of a kind of an attempt to impose new norms, like his, I don't know, the things he did that were like doxing people and things like that. It was as if he was positing himself as some kind of enforcement agent as well as a disruptor and somebody who was, but what's interesting about him now is like whenever he claimed to be cured of his gayness or whatever, and to really become a sort of conservative Christian. But what was weird was over the summer, he kind of made this argument in favor of cancel culture. And basically it was
Yeah.
like, well, cancel culture is how you enforce norms. Like you enforce norms by shaming and humiliating people for deviating from them, right? And that wasn't entirely, again, at odds with his prior kind of performance art, right? Where
Yeah.
he would sort of try to like name and dox people who were emblematic of some sort of left-wing degeneracy or deviation, deviancy that he wanted to call out. And so, but I mean, it is interesting that the right has this kind of simultaneous position of being the kind of breaker of norms and violator of norms, and at the same time is also doing things like, I mean, Milo is kind of an unserious example, but like, I mean, it's really notable to have a party that's like, we're the party of the free speech absolutists of Elon Musk and so on. But then at the same time, to have people who are like within the, hierarchy of the party, like advocating a total ban on pornography, right? Like that's just like a fundamental, sort of tension within the whole. And like, people might say, oh, well, like free speech about politics is one thing, but like pornography is another, which you might say, but it's also true that if you look at the history of First Amendment interpretation, these things have gone together. Like the relaxation of obscenity laws kind of went along with the broader expansion of First Amendment rights. And so there is like just a sense that this kind of hyper libertarian, in some ways kind of very new left approach to norms and taboo breaking and so on is in tension with this desire to assert and enforce norms. And I think it's like a really deep contradiction in the coalition that I'm not sure how it's going to turn out, but it'll be interesting.
Yeah, and I just think, I mean, all of this, the fact that we're able to call norms into question to this extent, I mean, I feel like it kind of confirms the Zizek's whole thing that Trump is like the kind of archetypal postmodern political figure that like now that we're even talking about these things, I think it's because he embodies this triumph of the postmodern of in all of its iterations, especially, I mean, all these Baudrillardian tropes that we see playing out right now. So again, I mean, I'm interested to see how this will open the door to kind of, I don't know, something fresh, something potentially new, but not naive either about the new forms of absurdity this is going to bring in, into the discourse. But to be seen, to be seen. So, Geoff, thank you for coming on to discuss the topic, and thank you all for joining. If you're not already a member of Interintellect, you can subscribe on their webpage. You can follow them on X, on social media. But thank you again for joining us.
Thanks, Steven.
All right.